So, welcome to our podcast series, Eric. It's great to have you here.
Yes, thank you, Deirdre, for the invitation. It is my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And thanks for doing this all in English. I know in the Netherlands, your native language is Dutch. So, I appreciate that you have joined us in English. So, to start off with, can you tell me a little bit around your background? How did you get involved in business and enterprise architecture? What were your motivations to do that?
Yeah, it was actually quite a long time ago that I was faced with the question of what I wanted to do when I left school. So we're going way, way back with this. So after studying English language and literature, a series of coincidences actually led me into the world of what we now call IT. So I started out with installing computer systems, building networks, but soon after that, I developed a passion for thinking up solutions without being directly involved in implementing them. And this then later evolved into a desire to translate the strategic direction of organizations into its implementation. So in a nutshell, I started my career in systems engineering. I think that is the term. And over the years, I moved into architecture. So it was a natural flow to go that way. So initially, my focus was on, I think, IT infrastructure, but then I soon realized that focusing on this one area alone would not ensure that an organization would actually be able to fully realize change and thus deliver on its strategy. So I saw the need to give appropriate attention, so to say, to all the domains within the context of architecture, which resulted in me pursuing a career in enterprise architecture. Now, I've been fortunate enough, I would think to say, to work with a wide range of employers over the last, I think, 15 years or so. And these have ranged from commercial and financial institutions to government agencies and even the healthcare sector. And it was partly due to I think the diversity of these employers that I've been able to work with enterprise architecture in different industries and to see and experience the application of this great discipline or profession from very different perspectives. Now, because I to keep my knowledge and my skills up to date, because I believe that as human beings, we actually never stop learning. And that of course includes things related to the field of architecture. I've been reading a lot about enterprise architecture and therefore also about business architecture. And I also took and successfully completed the certified business architecture course a few years ago, or perhaps a year and a half ago. And the way in which both business architecture on the one hand, enterprise architecture on the other hand, provide guidance on how to translate the organizational strategy into an appropriate implementation, for example, is something that I myself find immensely interesting. So this is, I think, the main reason why I've dedicated myself to training in both areas.
Just a question on the business architecture while you're there. So, what motivated you to just go for that certification? Was there something missing that you saw between enterprise architecture and business architecture, or were you just interested in what it had to say?
Yeah, like I said, I'm always eager to learn more than what I've already learned so far. And I think that the way that the organizational part of architecture or what we now call the business part of architecture was quite often missing from the way organizations handled architecture. So the focus was mainly on the IT part or perhaps even the application domain, but not so much on what was happening on the business side. So I thought, let's not have just me saying things like we need to focus more on the business side. Let me follow the course, take the course of business architecture so that I have a little more baggage from where I can show the organization some tools or guidelines or perhaps guidance would be a better word. So yeah, maybe in order to answer your question, yeah, maybe I was feeling that something was missing, but I couldn't actually put my finger on it.
Mm.
So it is a valuable addition, I think, to all the stuff I learned so far about enterprise architecture. So on the one hand, being part of enterprise architecture, the business domain, the business layer, but actually taking the course of business architecture made it much more clear and provided far more guidelines that are usable in the everyday situations.
Yeah. Awesome. So what are some of the key experiences or turning points that have shaped your career? So there must be some things that have happened over time that has led you to where you are today.
Yeah, I think that throughout the years there have been so many turning points, and I think each one being perhaps even more prominent than the previous one. But there is perhaps this one key experience that stuck with me. That is this, I think it's one situation. I think I was working for a hospital, and now you have to imagine that a hospital, although it has, of course, a board of directors, or mostly has a board of directors, it is run informally by the specialists or the doctors, because it is that group that is really in charge. So if you keep that in mind, there was this situation where this hospital had to come up with a new strategy for the upcoming period. And of course, the cuts had to be made while the desire to grow within as the hospital in the region was one of the main drivers. So all these various departments within the hospital had done the best to come up with their own annual plans. But these plans were all separate from the organizational strategy and were often, how do you say, doomed to failure, I think, before implementation. Yeah. Simply because there was no link to the organizational strategy. So these departmental plans consist mainly of the wishes of these specialists or the doctors within those departments. Now, by, I think, applying stakeholder management, I was able to make all those different plans fit together and make the whole thing derivative. I don't know how to pronounce the word.
Yeah, that's right.
Of the organizational strategy. And I know this kind of sounds pretty static, but that is what it is if you put it in architectural terms. So what I actually did was engage with the stakeholders and ask questions to find out what was really important to them, to the separate departments, the specialists, the doctors. But I also pointed out that the hospital could not be run, of course, by one department alone. So they all needed to work together in order for the hospital to be able to survive. So together, again, we looked at the issues that we could see as drivers for the different departments, and that eventually led to shared vision of what was important for the hospital. And from there, this shared vision was then translated into specific goals and objectives, and those were then used as primary focus areas in those annual plans that I was talking about. So in this way, I was able to use architecture to create a shared and an organization-wide image. And in this hospital, I think the practical application of architecture ensured that what was once a siloed approach kind of disappeared, and the sense of working together on this common vision became more commonplace.
Yeah.
So I think that is a very powerful application of architecture in practice, in real life, and that has shaped the way that I try to use enterprise architecture in my work.
Did you use was your focus on capabilities or value streams, or what components of architecture was a real focus for you when working with the hospital?
Yeah, you have to understand that architecture in the context of a hospital is often very in an immature state. Throwing around terms like capabilities and value streams it won't find any ground, so to say. I was focused on getting the processes that were in place, getting those visualized, showing how the various departments or the roles that were in the hospital aligned with those processes, visualizing the organization in a somewhat easy way for people to understand. People who don't work with architecture could also relate to the architectural elements that were used.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think that's what often we want to say, especially to new people who come into architecture, showing the business a whole bunch of capabilities just looks like blocks. They don't know what it means. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. So in your own words, how would you describe the importance and the role of business and enterprise architecture and the change in today's organization? So you've mentioned a little bit around the hospital, and I can certainly relate to that. I think that's been a big challenge for many places around the world, including New Zealand. But what do you see would change in today's organizations?
Well, I think it is safe to say that I think the importance of business and, of course, enterprise architecture has proven itself throughout the years.
Yeah.
However, it is true that not all organizations, or perhaps even a very little number of organizations, have come to the same understanding about the value of business and enterprise architecture. So it is often a very ongoing challenge, or perhaps even the word fight would be a better fit for business and enterprise architects to draw attention to the added value of their roles. However, the value that a business or enterprise architect can bring to an organization often only manifests over time, and it will result in more efficient operations, like things like cost reductions, structured business processes, even a better fitting application landscape for that matter. And business architecture ensures that the average organization gains, I think, insight and control over its capabilities, its business functions, processes, and of course the relationships between them. And that is, I think, very important. So the insight that it provides often feels, I think, an eye-opener for many organizations. Now, if you, I think, combine this with the ability to visualize and to visualize the value it delivers to its customers or clients or patients in the context of a hospital, for example, using the value streams, and you as a business architect have a very, and I stress, very powerful steering element to guide the organization in translating its strategy into an appropriate implementation. So that's for business architects. But if you look at enterprise architecture, I think it takes it even a step further. Like it incorporates the insights from business architecture to even further extend the coherence into the information, application, technology domains, etc. So enterprise architecture thus provides, I think, a complete picture of the entire enterprise. And I deliberately say the word enterprise and not organization, because the scope of enterprise architecture, as the name gives away, can extend beyond the walls of the physical organization. So this is because an enterprise architecture is not only bound to the physical organization itself, but it also extends to the customers, the suppliers, the partners and whatnot. Now, and the relationship between all these stakeholders, the associated capabilities they provide, their processes, their ways of working, is, I think, the overall playing field of enterprise architecture. And both business and enterprise architecture use this insight gained into the organization to shape the change desired or perhaps required by the organization. And the impact of the proposed change or perhaps changes can actually be determined by, or not determined by, but can be determined, and I think the dependencies and possible consequences properly mapped out so that the change can be implemented in a more careful manner. And without business or enterprise architecture, I don't think that this is simply not possible.
I'd agree with you. I know everything's possible, right? People build houses without architects or builders or those kind of things. But if you really want a beautiful house, you're going to get somebody who's has some expertise.
Okay, you definitely got me there. Yeah, it is possible, but it's not, I think,
it's not
possible
ideal,
in the way that it should be.
Yeah. And I specifically often refer to AI. If we don't architect our AI correctly either, we're at risk of getting just a whole bunch of bad data again, like we have for decades now where we reading and working with data that doesn't really add value. So having that architectural structure, I agree with you, is really important.
Yeah.
Could you perhaps share us a project or an initiative where your skills as an architect played a critical role, and what were your challenges or your outcomes that came from that?
Yeah, I think I can do that. Let me just think. If you talk about the skills playing a crucial role, I think anyone can quickly come up with things like organizational sensitivity and having political feelers.
Amen. Yeah.
What I mean by that is that as an architect, being in business or enterprise, you should always be aware that you're moving on this strategic level within the organization. So if you want to play your role properly, you need to be able to walk and talk on that level. So if you're talking to, I think they're called C-level stakeholders, you need to realize that there may be some hidden agendas that need to be considered. And of course, also stakeholders may not always show the back of their tongues, sometimes say A when they actually mean B. And this was the case, for example, in an institution where I worked some time ago. And I think the situation arose that a reorganization was imminent. However, this reorganization was not yet widely known within the entire organization. So it was very sensitive to talk about it. And what made my work even more difficult was that I was asked to create a business information plan that would enable the organization, or at least part of it, to start professionalizing. So for the transition to this design and situation, it was very important to, I think, take into account that the impending reorganization was happening and being able to sense the sensitivity of it all, of this information that proved to be crucial. So had I taken little or even no account of this, that many people would have become very nervous, I think, in the run-up to the implementation of the proposed changes. So understanding, I think, what information you can and also cannot share will help you develop an approach that respects the organization's political agenda.
Yeah, that's quite a hot topic, isn't it? There's quite a lot happening in that space around privacy and ensuring that what is being said is managed.
And of course, perhaps a side note, I also find that many organizations luckily do have some form of strategy, but they often fail to share that strategy with the entirety of the organization. So not every employee in the organization is aware either that the strategy exists or what their role in the entirety is. And I think it is very important that everyone within the organization knows which or what part they have to play within the company strategy. So that doesn't mean that you need to sit down with every employee and make them part of every meeting you have about the strategy. Most certainly you don't have to do that. But I think there was some research by the Harvard Business School in 2020 that showed that 95% of the people in organizations had no idea what the company strategy was because they're not.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
Because if you've got to do the work, understanding the purpose of that work, I know not everybody cares about that, but it certainly would make sense to me for those who do care about the purpose, that they at least know what that strategy is and what the purpose of what they're doing matters.
You would say, but that there are a lot of people, I think, that go to work, have a 9-to-5 job, do their thing they've always been doing for years and years in a row.
Yeah.
And perhaps don't even, I'm not sure if I can say not care, because they might actually care, but because they don't know what they should care about.
Yeah.
They don't pay enough attention to it, I think.
Yeah. And sometimes I understand that not everyone's passionate about work. I'm someone who's passionate about the work that I do, but I know not everybody's like that. Some people enjoy their time with their families and those kind of things. But yes, I still think being part of that environment is really important just to understand why we're doing the things we're doing. So how do you see the field of business and enterprise architecture evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? Are there any specific trends or shifts that you might anticipate? Think of AI, think of the role of business architecture versus enterprise architecture. What do you see happening in the future?
I actually do not have I don't know how you call it. It's a glass bulb to look into
Yes.
the future. But I think if you look at the business and enterprise architecture, it's safe to say that the profession will continue to grow as a discipline. And if you look at Europe, its rise here in Europe has been somewhat slower than I think, for example, in the United States, where it has a bit more body. But nevertheless, I'm convinced that the clarity that business and enterprise architecture can provide can help organizations to gain insight into their business operations and to identify improvement actions. So, for example, before business architecture, organizations relied on, I think, the information that was mostly in the heads of people who work there. And business architecture makes visible, or visualizes, I think that's a better way to say it, visualizes what was previously invisible, the relationship between all those different business units. And that can be in the realm of capabilities or business functions, processes. But today it can also be in the realm of information concepts, application landscape, and whatnot. So my expectation is that business architecture will grow considerably in the coming years, at least here in Europe, in terms of its use in the business world. And I think it will become more widely used in the coming years. Whether it will evolve on its own, it's harder to say, but perhaps the advent of AI will be able to play some role, perhaps even a significant role. So I think that AI, if you look at AI, it will be able to support the profession or the field. And I think especially on a more operational level. So again, if you look here in Europe, for example, you see a lot of experimentation in, let's say, the healthcare sector to generate AI-driven consultations, for example. So in itself, it might seem like an innovative solution that could save time for the doctors or the specialists. But I think that is just the theory. I think the practice is a bit more challenging at this moment, because slightly older patients, I think, have little or no appetite for let's say, a chatbot telling them how they are doing, what is wrong with them, how they should deal with it. So this group of patients would still rather talk to a flesh and blood kind of person. Yeah. And that is why I think the use of AI, at least in healthcare, will have to wait for the next generation, and the generation that has grown up with a more modern technology. And I think that they are far more likely to accept some kind of automated advice during consultations. Now,
it's very interesting what you're saying, and I'm going to just ask you a question. So obviously for many European countries, including non-European, us in New Zealand, there's an aging population, right? And so the amount of workers to the amount of people who will need healthcare is quite significantly different. You mean that you're not going to get an AI, let's say, bot or robot to come and help the business? Do you think that having tools and technology like, let's say, it could be just your machines to test your blood pressure, to be able to do all of this at home, do you think that if you architected that along with what's going on in AI, that could help? And the reason I'm asking you this is because in New Zealand, we had several years ago, just before the earthquake, there was this recognition that our aged care is going to become a real issue. And so the way that was approached was to say, how do we get healthcare in the home? So how do we ensure people can be healthy at home? Because also being in hospital doesn't always make people healthy, right? Because itself is a difficult space to be in. And so Christchurch specifically post-earthquakes looked at how do you get healthcare in the home? And that really involves several things: design thinking, architectural thinking, critical understanding of customer needs, and so forth. So what do you see in the European market? Is it similar? Would architecture help with this?
I think to provide a short answer, yes, I think it would and could help with this, most certainly. What I do not see at this moment, especially again, if you look at the more elderly patients, if I take my parents, for example, they are mid-70, and they have this tendency of mistrusting technology that provides them with some kind of status about their health, or it tells them what they should or should not do, and that they seem to have a hard time accepting it from something other than a person.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have all kinds of technology like automated blood pressure measurement toolings, or watches that will generate notifications or measure some things about your health situation. I think for the generation that I'm from, it will definitely be a step forward to what we're used to. For the elderly generation, I'm not that sure.
Yeah, they're not digitally native,
No.
and therefore it's not going to be a natural. And I think having people with you also matters, right, in everything that we do.
Yeah. But if you
All
look,
right.
for example, at my children, I have two boys of 17 and 15. They've been growing up with everything that is digital. And I remember my youngest son, when he was 4, he used to grab my wife's phone and learn to swipe on it. And then one day he was watching television. He had never watched television before. So he walked up to the screen and started swiping on the television screen.
It's
Yeah.
hilarious.
So they're actually growing up with all this technology. And I think that makes it far more likely that they will accept everything that is coming their way.
I must be honest, the age that I'm in, where we grew up with no technology, when I say no technology, very little compared to what there is today, and personal technology, that is. And now today, where basically the next generation has all of this technology, I feel quite happy to have been in the middle, to see both sides. It's quite exciting, actually. That's at least how I look at it. I know that you've written a book, Eric. It's called Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture. I also know that you've got some key challenges and opportunities in the current roles that you're working in. So combining a little bit of your experience and the opportunities that you see, why did you write the book? What was the motivation to write the book?
It's a really good question. I think that what I was missing, if I look back at my career history over the past 10, maybe 15 years or so, working for different organizations, I think that all these organizations had one thing in common. They all wanted to start working with architecture, but they did not have a clear know-how or knowledge on how to actually start working with architecture. So they wanted to implement enterprise architecture, in this case, in its full breadth. Everything there is to it, they wanted that implemented. So the scope was way too large in that regard. So that was something that I write blogs in my spare time. I like writing about the profession, certain topics that I like to start discussions on. I'm very active on LinkedIn, for example, posting all these blogs. So I thought maybe that's a good idea for an upcoming blog. How do you start using enterprise architecture? But then I started writing, and I kept on writing. So actually, the book, I wouldn't say wrote itself, but it really began to develop. So that is how the book actually came to be.
I think it's a great title for one. And then also because I think that's where the inertia comes in for a lot of people. You hear about it and then it's just, oh, it sounds too complicated. I remember when the term enterprise architecture first came out, to me, I just imagined Star Trek and a whole bunch of technology, and I didn't understand what people were saying around what does enterprise architecture mean. So I think it's a great title, How to Get Started, because a lot of people are just, there's just a barrier with understanding. Essentially, it's just architecting different aspects of the business and the organization. So well done on your book. You also mention in your book, I believe, the enterprise architecture implementation wheel. Could you maybe explain what that is, and what were the origins and the methodology behind the wheel? What were your thoughts around that?
As I like to call it, the enterprise architecture implementation wheel. So that's a mouthful that I described in the book. It takes the existing methodology from frameworks such as the TOGAF standard, mainly the TOGAF standard, but it applies it in a more practical and pragmatic manner. For instance, the order in which the frameworks indicate that you should start with architecture is different in the implementation wheel. So if you look at the structure and the sequence of the architecture development method, or the ADM in short, from the TOGAF standard, you will see that it starts with the preliminary phase, followed by the architecture vision phase. And these two phases, they focus on, of course, among other things, but defining or determining the goals and objectives that are associated with the architectural change. Now, if this architectural change is related to a specific task, such as the implementation of, let's say, new functionality or a product, or even changes in the way an organization conducts its processes, then this sequence is fine. However, if you look at an organization that is just starting to work with architecture, so architecture is either not present or even in a very immature state, then this sequence of the ADM is not so well applicable. And in such a case, it is very strange or rare that you, as an architect, are sitting directly at the board table talking about the formulation of goals and objectives. So in my experience, the journey of implementing an enterprise architecture then begins with, how do you say, taking stock of an organization, like mapping the organization's ability to do what it does, how it does this, with what. So basically creating an understanding of the capabilities, the business functions, processes, and so on and so forth. And then using what you might call, I think the word is reverse engineering, or a bottom-up approach. You'll be able to relate the information back to the goals and objectives of the organization. And this is a major difference in the sequence of the steps described in the implementation wheel, and where it differs from the standard ADM approach as provided by the TOGAF standard.
Okay. And do you think, can you just, so I understand a little bit better, if, let's say, you had a startup company, right? Let's call it a high-tech company run by a lot of young people. How would you have your first conversation with them? What would the approach be to look at how they're going to run and operate as a business?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned this particular example, because this is exactly the one situation I describe in my book, that the implementation wheel does not directly apply its order as it is designed. So I actually mention a startup situation, a startup company, which would make the wheel be, no, let me rephrase, it would direct you to use the wheel, not starting from stage 1, starting from stage 2. You would then actually start with defining the goals and objectives, perhaps some requirements, principles, etc., and then revert back to stage 1, where it's the document stage, and then start filling in the blanks. Not as much inventorying the organization, because there is, as a startup, there is not much to inventory. You have to think what it could be in the future. So that's the one situation where the wheel does not start at its starting
At
point.
number one, yeah.
Yeah, but then again, the wheel, hence the name, it is a round iterative approach. So you basically can start at any point, any stage in the wheel.
Mm.
But yeah, you managed to name the one situation where the wheel doesn't apply.
I could see there's definitely application in, like we've spoken about, the health industry with all of the siloed approach, and putting those parts together in the beginning is going to be essential in getting that architecture, understanding of the business and putting those parts together. All right. So what skills do you feel, skills, tools, competencies, all of those things would be critical for a successful business and enterprise architect? And do you think it's changed? Like, is it the same as it always has been, or has it changed?
Perhaps there are some slight changes noticeable, but I think most people would answer this question with things like you need to have analytical skills or conceptual skills. But I believe, and I think I mentioned this before, because both business and enterprise architecture are strategic disciplines, I think it is necessary that you are able to move smoothly across the various layers of the organization. So here they come again, the political feelers, the political antenna, and organizational sensitivity. I think those are important skills to possess. There are all kinds of I think, interests at play at the higher levels of an organization, interests that sometimes not clearly expressed in the stated goals or the intended objectives. So you must be able as an architect to sense this phenomenon and be able to interpret these underlying interests. You need to keep in mind that when you're designing the organization, the moment when the strategy is to be translated into appropriate implementation, you need to be able to sense what is going on there. So, and perhaps another, and I really want to mention this one, another critical skill I think that is often overlooked or perhaps even systematically ignored is the ability to listen, really listen, and listening to what stakeholders have to say, because sometimes they say one thing but mean something else. Now, if you can listen really well, you will get the real message from what they are saying. The stakeholders do not always show the back of their tongues. So it is not always clear from the outset what the exact requirements or the concerns of the stakeholders are. Being able to really listen to them and ask follow-up questions, that will allow you to get to the heart of the matter. Now, I've seen quite a lot of architects in my career, and a large group of them, and I think this is the same also for common IT people, I think, they're not immediately known for their excellent communication skills. And I think that is really an issue today, or even today, or still today. So enterprise and business architecture is so much more than just creating diagrams and other kinds of models, as it is increasingly focused on the strategic side of the profession far more than the operational side.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Being able to communicate and have clarity. I think architecture, we really want to have clarity. It's one of the pillars of change management. It's not, we don't need certainty. We just need to be clear on what we agree on and what the message is. And we do that with diagrams, but also, as you were saying, with working with people to truly listen so that we ourselves have that clarity on what it means. Could you please share some advice or lessons learned for people who are in the profession or entering or growing their careers in business architecture or enterprise architecture? What advice would you give these individuals?
I think what I've noticed over the years, and I've been, like I said, doing this for 15, maybe 18 years or so, is that the field or the profession of architecture does not always paint a very clear picture of how it should be used. So in many cases, it is almost immediately associated with IT. So 9 times out of 10, architects are also positioned within the organization in the IT department where they actually don't belong. Of course, IT architects aside. So enterprise and business architecture, yeah, I think the name is a big hint in the right direction, but they are both business-oriented functions, so they belong on the business side. And I think positioning them on that side of the organization actually multiplies the decisiveness and the efficiency of the role, because a well-positioned business or enterprise architect can move far more efficiently if he or she can operate from a broad and organizational playing field rather than from the largely reactive corner that is IT. So if an organization wants to get the most out of its architecture function, then positioning the architecture on the business side, the architecture function on the business side, is actually essential. So my advice to novice or starting architects would be, they would do well to recognize this and be careful not to go hiding in the IT department, because the strength of business and enterprise architecture lies in its ability to translate the impact of the organizational change into its strategic goals. And this is only possible if the architect has a clear position in the organization. So from the right place in the organization, I think issues related to the implementation of the strategy can be thought through from the very beginning, rather than being confronted with the solution direction, or in some cases even a fully designed solution where the architect is only asked to test whether the solution meets the requirements.
Yeah.
So in that latter case, architecture is, I think, relegated to running through a checklist, which of course is not enterprise nor business architecture. Mm-hmm. So the more architects actually adopt this mindset, the clearer it will be to organizations that enterprise architecture, as I've said many times before, but not directly to you, I think that enterprise architecture is a strategic business management tool. It is not a technical instrument. So that will be my advice to starting architects. Please realize that you're on the strategic and business side of the organization, and enterprise architecture, and even business architecture for that matter, is absolutely not a technical instrument.
Yeah. I think that's also where some of the misalignment in terms comes in, because like I was saying to you, a lot of people, when they hear enterprise architecture, don't even want to go into the profession, and they might even be good at it because they think they have to have all these technical skills. They've got to be programmers and whatever. Yeah, I agree with you. It's some good sound advice to say, if you're good at understanding strategy and business, and you really want to get into the career of being able to architect things, it's good to go into that.
So if we look back way, or the point where architecture, I don't know the word in Dutch, you have to perhaps cut this out, where it originated, yes, that is the word. The Mr. John Zachman, back in 1987, he started with some kind of framework. We now call it the Zachman framework, and it originated from the technical side of what we now call architecture. So it was very IT driven at that point, but of the last, I think, 3 decades, architecture has evolved into a full-blown, including business architecture framework. So it is by far not only or strictly related to the IT part of it. And I am time and again, I am amazed at organizations clinging to the idea that was valid back in 1987, that enterprise architecture has only to do with IT.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It's crazy, isn't it? All right, final question for you, and thanks for joining us. I'd like to ask the question, if you could give yourself, go back in time to the young Eric, what advice would you give yourself when you start in the career?
Now, that is a very difficult question. It is even impossible, because I simply cannot go back in time, nor have I any intention to do. But maybe if I could, I think I would say to myself that me being at that particular time, I think I should have read more about the profession before I jumped in. I think that if I'd taken more time, or if I had been given more time to do more reading, I think I would have had a better idea from the beginning of what the profession entailed and how to best use it. So often when you start in architecture, you don't have a real clear starting point. You roll from one job to another. It's a natural flow. And it's at some point you realize that you're actually working on architectural issues. And from that moment on, you go through life as an architect. So from then on, all the positions you hold, you consciously choose to call yourself an architect. But the beginning, the transition from a position that doesn't have anything to do with architecture to one that does, it's not all that clearly identifiable. So if you had the opportunity, if I would have had the opportunity to read up on it before that moment, I think I would have had a better picture of what the job entails, and perhaps would not be directly pigeonholed into the IT department.
I agree with you. If you think of all the body of knowledges that we've gathered, unlike other professions like medicine and those kind of things, they've evolved and grown, but they have had processes and things over the years. Whereas I think in your IT, your enterprise, your architecture, your digital landscape, let's say, that's very new. And we've had to really figure out stuff as we go along. But I agree, some clarity on what that was early on would be great. Yeah, and not so crazy. All right. So, Eric, I just want to say thank you for your time, for sharing your story. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that? How would they get in touch or have a look at your book or any of those resources? What's the best option?
I have this website. It's called eawheel.com. So that's Enterprise Architecture Wheel. A slight hint to the implementation wheel I designed. And there you can find a contact form that you can use. Or, of course, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just search for me there, and I'm sure I will pop up.
Okay, that's great. So we'll share your links and everything after the podcast. And obviously, there'll be a website so people can get further links. But yes, follow Eric on LinkedIn. That's going to be your easiest path, as I say to most people in the podcasts. But it's been great having you here, and thank you for joining me in your evening. It's early in New Zealand, but it was great having you join us today.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Deirdre. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.